The Wyoming wind had teeth. It cut across the open land like a blade. Slicing through cloth, skin, and hope alike. Dust rolled low along the trail, curling around the broken wagon as if the earth itself was trying to bury it. The wagon leaned to one side. Its left wheel split clean through, the axle cracked and sagging like a wounded limb. Beside it stood a woman who no longer remembered what it felt like to stand straight. Her back was bent not from age, but from grief, from hunger, from days and nights that had not allowed her to rest. Her name was Eleanor Whitaker. Though no one had spoken it with kindness in nearly a year, she gripped the wagon's wooden rail with raw, bleeding hands and pulled, boots sliding in the dirt. Her teeth clenched, as though sheer will might convince the wagon to move. It didn't. Behind her, 7 children huddled together, their faces streaked with dust and tears, their small bodies trembling in the cold. The youngest cried without sound, mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, too weak even for sobs. The others watched their mother in silence, having learned that crying wasted energy they no longer had. Eleanor had not always been this woman. Once she had lived in a small but sturdy house near the Platte River, where cottonwoods shaded the porch, and her husband's laughter filled the evenings. Thomas Whitaker had been a gentleman with strong hands, a farmer who believed the land would always provide if you treated it right. When he died, it wasn't sudden like a gunshot or dramatic like a duel. It was slow, a fever, days of burning skin and whispered prayers. By the time the preacher came, Thomas was already gone, and Eleanor was left holding a future she didn't know how to carry. The farm didn't last long without him. The drought came, then the debt collectors, then the quiet looks from neighbors who were struggling too hard to offer help. Eventually, all she had left was this wagon, these children, and a trail that promised work somewhere west if she could just reach it. Now the trail had turned against her. She had walked ahead of the wagon for hours, dragging it foot by foot until the wheel finally gave out with a sharp crack that echoed across the plains. Eleanor remembered falling to her knees in the dirt, her breath leaving her in a broken sob. She hadn't allowed herself in months. She had stayed there longer than she meant to, forehead pressed into the ground, fingers clawing at soil as if she could dig herself a grave and be done with it. But then one of the children coughed, thin, rattling, and she stood again. Mothers didn't get to stop, not ever. The sun dipped lower, staining the sky red like a fresh wound. Eleanor tried once more, bracing her shoulder against the wagon and pushing with everything she had left. Her legs shook, her vision blurred. The wagon didn't move. She felt something inside her finally tear, not muscle or bone, but belief. She slid down the side of the wagon and sat, in the dirt, back against the wood, staring at the horizon. For the first time since Thomas died, Eleanor allowed herself to think the unthinkable. They were not going to make it. That was when the sound came. At first it was so faint she thought it was her imagination, the slow, steady rhythm of hooves striking earth. Eleanor lifted her head. The children heard it too. 7 small faces turned toward the west, eyes wide with a mix of fear and fragile hope. Riders on the frontier were not always saviors. Sometimes they were worse than hunger. Eleanor stood, instinctively placing herself between the sound and her children, her hands empty but raised slightly, as if that could stop a bullet. The horse appeared over a low rise, dark against the fading sky. It was a big animal, powerful and calm, moving without hurry. The man riding it sat straight in the saddle, long coat hanging still despite the wind. He didn't look like he was chasing anything. He didn't look like he was running from anything either. He rode as though time itself had agreed to wait for him. As he drew closer, Eleanor noticed the rifle across his back and the revolver worn low on his hip, the leather scarred and well used. His hat brim shadowed his face, but she could see enough to know he was older than she'd first thought, lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes. This was a man who had lived hard and survived it. He stopped a short distance away and sat there in silence, taking in the scene, the broken wagon, the pale children. the woman standing barefoot in worn boots that no longer fit. His eyes lingered on the split wheel, then moved to Eleanor's hands, red and cracked. Finally, they met her gaze. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment either, just a steady awareness, like a man measuring the weight of a decision he already knew he would make. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind howled between them, tugging at Eleanor's hair, carrying the smell of dust and fear. One of the children whimpered. Eleanor swallowed and forced herself to speak. "We don't have anything," she said, her voice hoarse. "If that's what you're looking for." She hated how weak it sounded, hated that she had to say it at all. The man tilted his head slightly as if considering her words. Then he swung down from his horse in a single smooth motion, boots hitting the ground with quiet finality. He stepped closer, slow enough not to frighten the children. Up close, Eleanor could see the scar running along his jaw, pale against weathered skin. His eyes were a light, unreadable grey. "Come with me," he said. That was all. No explanation, no promise. Just 3 words spoken like a fact. Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. "We can't pay you," she said. "We don't have food. We don't even have a working wagon." "I know," he replied. Something about the way he said it, calm, absolute, made her chest ache. "Why?" she asked, the question tearing its way out of her. "Why?" The man looked past her then, toward the children. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Because leaving you here would kill you," he said. "And I don't leave folks to die." Before Eleanor could respond, a distant sound drifted across the plains, a shout carried on the wind. The man's head snapped up, his posture changing instantly. His hand moved closer to his revolver, not touching it yet, but ready. Eleanor felt fear coil in her stomach anew. "Who's that?" she whispered. The cowboy's eyes scanned the horizon. "Trouble," he said simply. Then he looked at her again, urgency now replacing calm. "You need to decide, right now." The children pressed closer to Eleanor, sensing the danger, even if they didn't understand it. Eleanor looked at them, 7 lives depending on her, and then back at the stranger who had appeared out of the dust with an offer that felt like their last chance. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was taking them, but she knew what would happen if she stayed. She nodded. The man gave a single sharp whistle, and his horse stepped forward obediently. "Get the children ready," he said. "We don't have much time." As Eleanor turned to gather her family, the sound came again, closer now. Whoever was out there was moving fast, and the man who had just promised to save them stood quietly beside his horse, watching the horizon, preparing to fight. Here is Chapter 1, Part 2, continuing seamlessly from Part 1. The tension rises, danger moves closer, and the silent cowboy begins to reveal what kind of man he truly is. Chapter 1, Part 2, The Men on the Horizon. Eleanor worked with shaking hands, pulling the children together, whispering sharp instructions through her fear. There was nothing to pack. What little they owned already sat in the broken wagon, blankets, worn thin as spider silk, a sack of flour so light it felt like a cruel joke, a dented tin cup they all shared. The cowboy moved with purpose, untying the horse's bedroll and slinging it across the saddle. He lifted the smallest child without asking, settling her carefully against the saddle horn and securing her with practiced ease. She didn't cry. She stared at him with hollow eyes, as if she'd already used up every tear she had. The sound of voices grew louder, then by the sound of them. More than one. Eleanor's heart hammered so hard she thought it might give her away. She glanced back toward the wagon, grief flashing through her like a knife. That wagon had carried her life once. Now it would be left behind like a corpse on the trail. "Ma!" one of the older boys whispered. His name was Samuel, only 12, but already carrying the weight of a grown man's fear. "Who are they?" The cowboy answered before Eleanor could. "Men you don't want to meet," he said. "Stay close. Do exactly what I tell you." There was authority in his voice, not loud, not harsh, but unbreakable. The children obeyed without question, clustering around Eleanor and the horse. The cowboy helped 2 of the youngest climb onto the saddle behind the baby, then turned to the older children. You can walk? He asked. They nodded even though their legs shook. The first rider crested the rise to the west, silhouetted against the red sky. Then another. Then a third. Eleanor's breath caught. They were spread out, riding hard, kicking up dust. Whoever they were, they weren't just passing through. The cowboy's eyes hardened. He adjusted his hat and turned to Eleanor. "My name's Caleb," he said, as if this were an ordinary meeting on an ordinary day. "When I tell you to move, you move. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see." "What are you going to do?" she asked. Caleb checked the cylinder of his revolver with quick, practiced fingers. "Buy you time." Before she could protest, he swung into the saddle, then immediately dismounted again, handing the reins to Samuel. "You lead the horse. Head east along the low ground. Stay off the ridge. I'll find you." "But," Eleanor began. Caleb met her eyes. "I will find you." There was something in his gaze that made her believe him. Eleanor nodded, swallowing her fear, and turned the children eastward. As they began to move, the sound of hooves thundered closer. Caleb stepped away from them, positioning himself between the approaching riders and the fleeing family. He stood alone in the open, coat flapping, a lone figure against the vastness of the plains. "Hey!" one of the riders shouted as they drew nearer. "You there?" Caleb didn't answer. The men slowed, circling him warily now. 3 of them, rough-looking, unshaven, their clothes stained with dust and sweat. One wore a bandana pulled low over his face. Another carried a shotgun across his saddle. Their eyes flicked past Caleb, toward the retreating figures of Eleanor and the children. "You traveling with them?" the man with the shotgun asked. Caleb rested his hand lightly on the butt of his revolver. "No." "Then why'd you stop us?" The bandana man snarled. "Because you're riding too hard for men without good intentions." Caleb replied. The third man laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Ain't that a shame?" The laughter ended when Caleb drew his gun. The shot cracked through the air like thunder. One of the men screamed and tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Horses reared. The shotgun roared, blasting dirt where Caleb had stood a moment before. He moved fast, diving behind a low outcropping of rock, firing again with deadly precision. Another rider slumped in the saddle, blood darkening his shirt. The third man turned his horse and fled. Caleb stayed low, breathing steady, eyes scanning until he was sure the danger had passed. He stood slowly reloading with calm efficiency. 2 men lay on the ground, groaning but alive. Caleb approached them cautiously, his gun trained. "You follow them," he said coldly, "and I won't miss next time." They nodded frantically. Caleb mounted his horse and rode east, following the faint trail left by Eleanor and the children. He found them huddled in a shallow dip in the land, fear etched into every face. When Eleanor saw him, her legs nearly gave out. "They're gone," he said. "For now." "For now?" she echoed. Caleb looked toward the darkening horizon. "Men like that don't forget," he said. "And they don't forgive." They traveled through the night, keeping low, stopping only when the children could no longer walk. Caleb shared what little food he had, a strip of dried meat, a swallow of water, never eating until the children had their share. Eleanor watched him quietly, her gratitude tangled with a growing fear. This man had saved them, yes, but trouble followed him like a shadow. As dawn broke, pale light spilling across the plains, they reached a narrow canyon where the wind softened, and the ground dipped enough to offer shelter. Caleb finally allowed them to rest. "Who were those men?" Eleanor asked softly. Caleb stared out at the horizon. "The kind that prey on folks who can't fight back," he said. "And now they know I'm in their way." Eleanor looked at her children, asleep against one another, alive because of this stranger. "Then we're in danger because of you," she said. Not accusing, just stating the truth. Caleb nodded. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. "Will you still help us?" she asked. Caleb turned to her then, his expression unreadable but resolute. "I already am," he said, and as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the land, Eleanor realized that whatever future awaited them, it would be forged in blood and fire, and this silent cowboy was now bound to them all.